Awesome. Well, it's great to be with you guys today, as always. I hope you're all doing well. And yeah, as the guys were mentioning, it's so nice to sort of see church filling up again. And we're just trying to create as much space as we can to connect with as many people as we can on a Sunday, in person and online. And it's just a great pleasure to be speaking to you today as we do kick off this new series. Hands up if you have heard the expression blue sky thinking. Blue sky thinking. I thought that was just like, most people have heard if you're on the chat, let us know the phrase blue sky thinking. Is that in your repertoire? Do you use that phrase regularly? I feel like we use it a lot at the Minster. But then I started to talking to people, and I was saying, Red Sea thinking. It's kind of like blue sky thinking. And they were like, what's blue sky thinking? I've never heard that expression. So I was like, oh my goodness, the whole series could crumble before it's even begun because people don't even realize that blue sky thinking is a thing. So yes, blue sky thinking leads to red sea thinking. Anyway, it's not that important, guys. It's not that important. But yeah, why are we doing red sea thinking? Well, I want to talk to you today about transition. How we move from where we are to where we want to be. And it strikes me that the Red Sea is the best example of this, the biggest transition of all time. Egypt was a horrible place for the people of God. They didn't like it there. And they had a vision of being in a promised land. And the Red Sea was the transition. It was the ultimate transition. And I feel like we're all in a season of transition. So my sense was, as we journey through this series, we look at different aspects of the Red Sea narrative. That God's going to speak to you about the situation you find yourself in at the moment. God's going to give you some practical tips and tools for you to navigate through this season of transition. See, whether it's a personal transition or whether it's that big societal transition out of COVID and into whatever the new reality looks like, we all face change in our lives. Things shift, and your world likely looks very different now to how it did do perhaps a year ago. And I love this narrative from Exodus that really talks about transition. And let's be honest, transition is always a really, really difficult thing. Even if you're coming out of a hard situation, transition is hard because change is hard. Things that are familiar feel really comfortable and feel really safe. Even if they're quite toxic, we can often revert back to either negative coping mechanisms or toxic relationships or stay stuck in a job that's really not good for our mental health just because transition can be really tough. So we can stay in our kind of metaphorical Egypt, if I can put it like that. So we're speaking about transition, but it's not an easy thing at all. So the question I want to pose this morning is, how do we do it well? How do we transition well? And like I said, we're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 13 and 14 for the next 5 weeks and looking at the Red Sea narrative. But just a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with this story, the people of God at this stage in history find themselves in Egypt. And Egypt is a place of great oppression. It's a place of great slavery. It's a place of real hardship for the people of God. They're oppressed, and they're not just second-class citizens. They're seen as property of the Egyptians. So they work as slaves. They're mistreated. Their population numbers are capped. The firstborn children were wiped out. And there was Moses who escaped that fate. He was put in a basket, or as we call it, a Moses basket, pushed down the Nile. He found himself in Pharaoh's court, the king of Egypt. So he grows up not as a slave, even though his family were slaves. He grows up as a son of the Egyptian kind of monarchy. So he finds himself in a really strange situation, crisis of identity, because he's a son of the ruling family in Egypt, but he's an Israelite. He's part of the people of God. So that causes him, long story short, to run away from Egypt. And God speaks to him and says, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I want you to go to the most powerful, like the king of Egypt, and to tell him to let my people go. And Moses, like most of us, responds with feelings of inadequacy. Feelings of, I could never do that. I'm not good enough. I'm not an eloquent person. I'm not able to deliver this message to Pharaoh. But the Lord reassures him of his presence. The Lord reassures him of the fact that actually he will go before Moses. So Moses boldly goes to Pharaoh several times. And if you're familiar with the story, you'll know God sent several plagues to really warn Pharaoh. Pharaoh let the people go, and then he changed his mind and brought them back. Let them go, brought them back. Several plagues. They leave Egypt, and that is where we pick up the story today in Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. So it should come up on the screens, and this is what it says. When Pharaoh let the people go, that's from Egypt, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, this is a super interesting line in this narrative. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. That's a fascinating line to dwell upon. They've been miraculously delivered from a barbaric regime. They've left Egypt. Yet God says if he takes them through Philistine, if they face battle, they might go back to slavery. What's that about? Egypt was horrendous for them. So why might they return to Egypt? Well, I think this is a universal principle that we all face. When we face difficulties, we retreat to what is familiar, even if it's toxic. Here's something I read this week. 39% of the prison population, when they're released, reoffend within 12 months. There's like sky-high figures of people. I think 75% reoffend within 9 years. And a big proportion of those people do so in order to go back to prison because that is safe, that's secure, that becomes familiar to them, that becomes safe for them. And rather than having their own freedom, they retreat to prison. And we can think that's madness. But we all do this. Whenever we hit battles or difficulties, how often do we revert to unhelpful ways of thinking? Or back to unhealthy relationships? Or back to whatever your particular vice happens to be when we face a difficult moment in life. So it's absolutely fascinating. And I guess the point is, whenever we face the unfamiliar, we retreat to the familiar. Whenever we come into something that's new and different, we return to something that's old and the same. Whenever we come up against something that's scary, we go back to security. Or when it's different, we go back to the same. Does that make sense? Whenever in a season of transition we face those difficult moments, we will retreat to the familiar. And that is the danger. And that is what God says. That's why God says in verse 17 that he led them through the desert. Because actually, if they went on the short route and faced a battle, they would be tempted to return to Egypt. And just to put this on a kind of, to almost just flesh this out on a practical level, if you're in a job or something and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm gonna leave my job. I really feel like God's calling me over to this amazing new future. I'm gonna go for that job. I'm gonna go back to university or whatever it is. But you're stuck in your job. You can stay in that place because of the fear of moving out of that place, if that makes sense. It can be a fearful thing to move from familiarity into something that's unfamiliar. Even though there might be a compelling reason to do so. There might be a beautiful, amazing, awesome future over here. But actually, we find it easier to stay in Egypt. We find it easier to stay in what is familiar. And the thing I want to say is, when it comes to breakthrough requires us to be dissatisfied with the now. If you want to see a breakthrough in your life, you do need to be dissatisfied with where you are right now. If we take that into the sort of sphere of addictions, for instance, if you have a particular addictions to a substance or to alcohol or whatever it might be, you often need to have a real, not just dissatisfaction, but actually like a hatred for that thing that is ruining your life. You need to really be dissatisfied with something in order to see it removed from your life. And when we think about breakthrough and seeing a breakthrough and heading into a season of transition, it's so connected with us being dissatisfied with where we are now. And I don't mean that in a trivial sense. We all get dissatisfied and kind of like we want to, move on and do something different. We get itchy feet from time to time. It's not that. It's if you're in that place of slavery, that place of prison, that place of something really affecting your life or holding you back that is just destructive or toxic for you. We need to be dissatisfied with that in order to move forward. Because God will only lead you through battles that you are ready for. I find this really interesting in verse 18, that God leads the people, in verse 18, it says, by the desert road towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went out of Egypt ready for battle. The Philistine country might have been shorter, but the desert was the route that God led his people on. And so often in life, we might feel like we're going through a metaphorical desert. There might be an obvious shortcut to getting where we want to be, but God doesn't just lead us through that direct way. He leads us on the journey that he has for us. And the other thing I want to just say today is, you might be feeling like you're in that season, like you're in the desert. And you're like, why am I being taken on this route? God, what are you doing? What are you up to in my life? Why are you taking me through this? Why am I walking through this crisis? But God so often takes us on the route that is best for us. And the detour is divine. And it's in the detour that God is working. We see that from this passage really, really clearly. God's leading them on the right road. It might not be the easy road. It might not be the shortest road, but it's the right road for them. And here's the thing. God's not just interested in getting you to the destination. God's interested in forming you, shaping you, molding you into the person that he would have you be. God's so often much more interested in the journey through the desert, forming you into the person that he's making you to be, than he is the destination that he's taking you towards. And that's definitely the case in this passage. How frustrating it must have been for the people of God to go on this journey that was longer and was harder and was more complex. But actually, it was just the right route for them. And you might be feeling like that in your life at this moment. Perhaps COVID has brought situations into your life that you could have never foreseen. Or you're finding yourself at this moment walking through some really difficult stuff. But God is in the detour. God is working even in what you see as a distraction. God is using the challenges, the obstacles that you face to bring about in you more of the likeness of Jesus, to bring glory to his name. And you might be sat there thinking, It doesn't make sense. What's God up to? And so often in the midst of the crisis, we don't see what God's up to. It's in hindsight, in retrospect, we look back and we can see. It's interesting, I think, chatting to a lot of students at UCLan, at UCLan, I mean, let's be honest, this is no hard feelings towards UCLan, but it might not be everybody's first choice. A lot of students find themselves in Preston thinking, God, what are you up to? Preston wasn't my first choice. But after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years, they look back and they're like, God, you had me in exactly the right place. It might have looked like a detour. It might have looked like a distraction, but I could see you were working all things for good. That's so often the case with the Lord. It takes you on the desert road, not the direct path. Beware of another D, really, distractions. Because distractions are very different to detours. There's a divine detour where you're just taken down a road and you know the Lord's in it, the Lord's working. It might feel like a desert, it might feel difficult, but you sense God's working. Often the shortcut is the distraction. Sometimes the shortcut looks so tempting because it's like, oh, just nip through here, just do this thing and then you'll be happy. Just kind of stay in that relationship, stay in that job, stay doing what you're doing, and you'll be happy. But often it's the distractions that lead us to places we're not prepared for. It's interesting in the people of God. It says in verse 18, they left Egypt ready for battle, but God led them the way around the battle. I mean, often when we go on these detours, we have no idea about the battles that we're being saved from. When I lived in London, we had an app. You used to use an app called Waze. Google have bought it now, so it's been integrated into Google if you're interested in any of that stuff. But it was a sat-nav app. So you would go in London, you always use a sat-nav because it's always confusing when we lived there. And you would often find yourself on really random streets, going on really random journeys, and you'd be weaving in and out of traffic and round back streets and stuff like that. But of course, the sat-nav has the bird's eye view, and you never knew which, congestions or traffic collisions or, congestion or roadworks that you were avoiding. The sat-nav had the bird's eye view, and God has the bird's eye view of your life. It might not look like the journey that you expected to go on, but you can trust that God is working all things for the good of those who love Him. And it might not seem easy, but in the detour, God is forming you into the person that He is calling you to be. The detour is divine. And the final thing, God is with you as well. I love this passage because at the end, it talks about God's presence with them. Chapter 13, verse 20, it says, after leaving Succoth, they camped at Eltham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. I love that. So whether it was day or night, they could get up and go. They were ready. God's presence was always with them. And this is the thing when it comes to doing transition really well. God's presence is your weapon. God's presence is your guide. God's presence is what will take you through the Red Sea. Following Him, listening to Him, being obedient to Him. And so often we get distracted because we focus on the destination. We think, I want to be so much further down the track in my career. I wish that marriage partner would just show up so we could get on with married life. I wish that university that I've been applying to would just say yes and I'd get in. I wish that circumstance, that health problem that I've been battling with would just go away. So often we can be fixed on the physical outcome, the practical outcome that we want. But what God is calling us to do is to follow His presence. His presence is our guide. His presence is our weapon. And I love how the pillar of fire and the cloud guide the people as they journey through the Red Sea. So that's for you as well this morning. If you're battling with a transition and you're finding the unfamiliar feeling of not feeling like you're secure, or that your world has slightly shifted and shaken and the ground beneath you doesn't feel as solid as it once did. If that's you, God is saying to you this morning, follow my presence. I go before you, I go behind you. The road that you're on might seem longer and like a detour, but I'm working all things for good. And I'm going to bring glory to my name. And as we think about that, we think about Jesus who led the way. Jesus, like his life was like almost a transition. He's God, the eternal Son of God who becomes a human being in order to win us through the cross and his death and his resurrection. And he does so following where his Father leads. There's a scripture in John where it says, Jesus says, I only do what I see the Father doing. And that's our call this morning. Wherever you're at, if you're finding that you're on that road that just looks not how you expected it to look, then his presence goes before you. His presence goes before you. He will speak into your situation. He will lead you. He might not lead you immediately to the end of your journey, as we would all love, but he will lead you to the next step and the next step and the next step. And in the journey, he's at work in your heart, bringing about that character and bringing glory to his name, transforming you into the person that he would have you be.